Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast. It's a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and popular culture. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Tracy Asteria. Tracy, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Bruce. We're inching closer to spring, so it makes me happy. How's everything going with you?
Things are pretty good here. A lot of interesting stuff going on. We've had some great guests in recent weeks, and we're anticipating another very good one today. It's going to be with author and historian Jon Towlson, and we'll give Jon a proper introduction in a moment. But before we get to Jon, I did want to bring up something that you're interested in talking about. I'm interested too, and that is the recent announcement of nominations for the Rondo Award. And as you were telling me, you looked at the whole ballot, and a number of the guests that we've had here on the Ghostly Gallery podcast, they've been nominated in different categories.
Oh, absolutely. The list is phenomenal, just with all the different categories that they have going on. And if you scroll through, you can pick out probably 90% of the guests' work that we've had on the Ghostly Gallery podcast. So I think it's a phenomenal shout out to, the lovely talent and the friends that we've made over the course of 30 episodes.
Just to mention some of the guests that we've had on who have been nominated for the Rondo Hatton Awards. Greg Mank, nominated in the category of Best Article. Gary Rhodes, who has a new book out on vampires in silent cinema. He's been nominated for an article that he did last year. Mark DeWidziak's terrific book on Edgar Allan Poe, nominated in the book category. From films, Ansel Faraj, the director who's been on our program twice, his film Todd Tarantula has been nominated. The late David Skal, nominated for his great commentary on the Freaks video that came out. And we should mention, really nice touch by the Rondo people, they have dedicated this year's awards to David Skal, who unfortunately was killed in a car accident on January the 1st. Really one of the great historians and writers, knowledgeable people, and just a good guy, someone who was very helpful to me and a lot of other people in this industry. So those awards have been nominated in his or named in his honor for this year. And I think that's a very appropriate thing. Also wanted to mention, I guess we could call it a snub, may not intentionally have been a snub, but our good friend Tucker Christine was not nominated in the literary magazine category. He, of course, has been doing Dracula Beyond Stoker for a couple of years. He was nominated in that category last year, but not this year. So I would encourage people to submit a ballot and do a write-in. You can do write-ins in any of the categories. And there was also one other snub, if you will, Tracy. And that would be us. We were not mentioned for Best Podcast. Now, I'm going to say in fairness, we only started in June of 2023, so we weren't around for the full year, but we'll encourage people to write us in if they'd like. I mean, if we don't win, it's not a big deal, and I'm not expecting that we're going to win, but hey, it's always nice to get a few votes as well. I also should mention that our guest today has been nominated for contributing to a couple of anthologies, and he has been nominated about 6 times in the past as well for the Rondo. Our guest this week, and that is author, historian, and also university professor Jon Towlson. He writes regularly for a number of publications, including Starburst, Scream, and The Dark Side. He's written numerous books, including The Turn to Gruesomeness in American Horror Films, 1931 to 1936. Has also written Global Horror Cinema Today and Subversive Horror Cinema. His most recent book came out in 2023, and it's a book that we're going to spend a lot of our time on during this hour. It's really fascinating. It's called 40 Cult Movies From Alice, Sweet Alice to Zombies of Mora Tau. Joining us today from the United Kingdom, this is our first guest who is actually joining us from outside the continental United States or North America. We're very glad to have with us Jon Towlson. Jon, thank you. How are you doing?
Very well, Bruce. And well, thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't know that I was the first from outside of continental United States, so that's a great honor. So thank you very much.
It's amazing. Technology works across the ocean. And I have to mention, Jon, I absolutely love England. Way back when I was in college in 1986, I spent half of my junior year in a semester abroad program. I went to Roxton College, which, as I recall, is about 2 hours north of London. And I absolutely loved it. I loved the British people. So polite, so kind, welcoming. I loved the culture there. Every weekend, the school, Roxton College, offered us trips through all different kinds of places in England. One time we went to Stonehenge. Other times we went to London, the Parliament buildings. We went to, other government buildings. We saw the famous guards that don't move. Their expressions don't change. I absolutely love the culture there. And as I've said to my wife several times, if we ever decide we're going to leave America and live somewhere else, I think the only other country I would consider is England. I'm really a big fan. And I'm not just saying that because you're here. I absolutely love it.
Well, if you were 2 hours north of London, you may well have been somewhere near Nottingham, which is where I was born. And I would definitely recommend you making a trip there because, of course, it's Robin Hood country. And there's the famous Nottingham Castle there. I currently live somewhere pretty close to York, which is another wonderful sort of historical city, the second city in the UK. As I would highly recommend you visiting there. And actually, I'm somewhere between York and Whitby. That's where I live most of the time. And Whitby, of course, is famous as Dracula country. That's where Bram Stoker based his novel. So there are lots of places for you to go, Bruce, when you do make it over the ocean to England again.
Jon, tell us more about Whitby, what that's like.
It's not very much changed, actually, from the description that you find in the novel. You've got the abbey in ruins. You've got the wonderful St. Mary's Church, which sits high up on a cliff above 199 steps, which lead down into the town. You've got a pier that's got kind of two arms that extend into the sea. And across from that, there's a seat that's been dedicated to Bram Stoker. He's got a little plaque on it. Bram Stoker sat here, and he probably got a lot of his inspiration just from sitting in that seat, looking over at the various parts of the town. And just behind that seat, there's a row of houses, which in the novel included the guest house that Mina and her family would stay in when she came to visit Whitby in the novel. So yeah, it's if you're a fan of the novel Dracula, then Whitby's a place to go, and it's extraordinary, really, the way that Stoker took his inspiration from the geography and the topology of the place. There were a number of famous storms over the last couple of centuries in Whitby, including one that required the people of the town to physically carry the lifeboat over fields so they could, launch it into the ocean to try and rescue the fishermen who were in peril at sea. And I'm pretty sure that went down into the history books, went into the library in Whitby, and Bram Stoker, no doubt, sort of read through that and maybe got his idea for the storm that, crashes the Demeter and brings Dracula to England from that actual event that had happened probably 50 or 60 years before Stoker wrote the novel.
No, that's really interesting. I want to talk to you about growing up in England and becoming someone interested not only in writing, but writing about horror history. When did that begin for you? At what age did you decide, yeah, I love horror and I love it so much I want to write about it?
Well, I think the love of horror came from a very early age, but it stems from a love of films, really. But that love of films comes from a kind of lack of films in my childhood. I grew up in a town called Grantham, which is more famous for being the birthplace of the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And the town from 1972 to 1982, during my formative years, had no cinema, had no movie house. And actually, to go to the movies, you had to travel to Nottingham or other places that quite a few miles away. And at that time in the UK, we only had 3 TV channels. This was before VCR, you know, and we didn't really get to see many films. But I loved films for some reason. I really loved them. So I couldn't get to see them. So what I did was I started to collect. I used to read comics and magazines about films. And one of the magazines that I read when I was 10 years old was called The House of Hammer magazine, which it's a magazine that looked not only at Hammer movies, but contemporary movies that were coming out at the time. And this was around about 1977. So the movies that I was reading about at 10 were films like Alice, Sweet Alice, The Redeemer, Blue Sunshine, Audrey Rose. Those are all the movies coming out, and they were being covered by House of Hammer magazine. Movies that I couldn't see, because I couldn't hardly see any movies. But what happened was that VCR came out, in the early 80s, as you know. It really took off, especially in my town, as we didn't have a cinema, and suddenly all of these movies appeared on video, and I became a kind of a cult movie aficionado in my early teenage, 14, 15. And I just kind of rent all these movies. Used to rent all the video nasties. I don't know if you know about the video nasties furore that happened in this country. A lot of independent distributors put out a lot of cheap movies, and with sensationalized covers, movies like Driller Killer and I Spit on Your Grave and Lucio Fulci's movie. And the newspapers kind of got hold of this and turned it into a kind of moral panic, which led to the government stepping in and decreeing that all movies should be certificated or classified, because before then there was no regulation of home video. So that just kind of pushed these movies underground. And I guess it was around about that time I started reading Starburst, and I was just started to sort of absorb film journalism from that point, because I'd read a lot of film books as well. I started writing for a college magazine. I had a little column in my college magazine. It's called Talking Turkey, and I basically just wrote about all the really bad movies that I was watching on video. Movies like Night of the Demon from 1980. It's kind of like Michael Medved approach of just kind of taking the mickey out of these bad movies. So that really kind of started me writing about films. But it took me a long time to kind of get into film journalism. Before that happened, I went into filmmaking, making my own movies on Super 8, then 16 millimeter. And from there, I went into higher education, did my degree, masters, and so on, and became a film lecturer. And around about 1999, I suddenly got interested in horror movies again and thought I'd really like to write a book about horror movies. And that eventually became my first book, Subversive Horror Cinema. And kind of in between times, I started getting involved in film journalism, and I actually started writing for Starburst, that magazine that I was reading as a teenager.
Yeah.
So things have had a kind of nice kind of circularity about me returning back to that love of horror movies.
John, you mentioned the censorship of the 1980s. Was there a lot of censorship prior to that, earlier decades, in terms of British productions, or were filmmakers relatively free to put the kinds of horror content on film that they wanted to?
Well, there was the British Board of Film Censors, as they were known before uh, the early 1980s. They changed the name to the British Board of Film Classification when the law was decreed, the Video Recordings Act in 1984, that all home movies had to be certificated. Before that, the industry basically regulated itself. So this was the first time censorship had become law in the United Kingdom. And of course, it's a political hot potato in many ways. But in terms of horror movies, there'd been certification in the cinema by the British Board of Film Censorship, as they were known. Since the 30s, really, the late 30s, when movies like The Raven, Universal's The Raven 1935, really kind of proved to be a tipping point in this country, and I think in the States as well, that the Production Code Administration started to clamp down on horror movies as they had gangster movies and sex pictures by the mid-1930s in the States. Same thing happened in Britain, so you got the H certificate, which was a special certificate to denote that there was horrific content in movies. And from that point onwards, I think the British Board of Film Censorship, as it was called, kind of saw horror as a special thing, that had to be looked at quite closely. So after Psycho in the 1960s and kind of the Wild Bunch, and you started to get these movies that pushed the boundaries of violence and sex in the late 1960s. The BBFC started to look at horror again pretty closely. And it kind of led up really to the Video Recordings Act 1984, when they did start to come down pretty tough on horror movies, and they did the same the decade after in the 1990s.
Have they kind of regulated it a little bit differently now? Like, do they seem to be a little bit more lenient over in the United Kingdom?
It's a lot more lenient now. All of those, a certain number of movies were banned, and they were in effect banned. They were denied certification, which meant that cinemas wouldn't show.
Okay.
A number of movies were actually prosecuted in this country as being obscene. These are horror movies, but those are the ones that got caught up in the lead up to the Video Recordings Act. But a number of films in this country have been denied certification as early as the kind of early mid-1970s. Films like The Last House on the Left denied a certificate in this country for a long time. And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Hard to believe now that movie was denied a certificate, except in London when it first came out in sort of 1974. Those movies kind of gradually have been given certification. So from the kind of mid to late 1990s onwards, that's when the BBFC changed hands. You got new personnel coming in, and things just started to become a little bit more relaxed. There's not the same level of concern, I don't think, over horror movies now as there has been in the past.
Oh, thank you.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, when you look at that movie, there's really not that much gore. There's a lot of suggestion about what's to happen, but they tend to cut away at those moments. So it's really much more suggested than graphic. And yet England banned the film. That's really surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it was first released in this country, the BBFC did look at it to see what they could remove. to see if they could give it a certificate. But what they said is that the movie itself is just too intense. It's the intensity, it's the tone of the movie, the sense of threat that's suggested that actually causes the problems. So you can cut the movie to ribbons, and it wouldn't necessarily. There was nothing specific that they could pinpoint that they could take out that would be acceptable.
Yeah.
It was released in London, as I mentioned earlier, but even then it was slightly cut.
Yeah.
Slightly cut. I saw that version when it first came out on video, and there's not a great deal taken out. I think there's a little bit of that scene where Pam's hanged on the meat hook. And then Leatherface starts up the chainsaw, and in the full version you see him kind of dismembering a body. Although even then it's not particularly graphic. But in the version released in London, they kind of cut just at the point where he starts the chainsaw up. So I think that's pretty much maybe the only cut in it. I can't remember a long time. Saw that. I was actually kind of back in the early video days when I saw that on VHS. You know, the version that had been allowed in London. So I'm going to go from a long time ago in terms of memory. What is that? 40 years? 40 years ago. I can't believe it.
Almost 50. Yeah. You know, you mentioned earlier that when you first became interested in horror, it was contemporary horror from the 70s and the 80s. Did at any point you gravitate toward some of the vintage Hammer films or even the Universal Studios films? Did those become of interest to you?
I think it was, I was interested in Hammer first, because those were the films that would actually be shown on TV. So of the 3 channels, that were available, there would sometimes be late night Hammer movies on. So I'd watch those, and I was a fan. I was particularly a fan of the Dracula movies, the Christopher Lee movies. They really scared me. There's something about Christopher Lee as that character that really kind of got under my skin. And I remember that I would be terrified even just by pictures of him, And my brother is older than me, and he used to sadistically chase me with pictures of Christopher Lee through the corridors. I grew up in a pub, and we used to live above the pub. And of course, when the pub was closed during the day, as they were in those days, it was quite spooky. It was kind of like living in The Shining, in a hotel in The Shining. So I have all these great big long corridors with empty kitchens and things. And he used to chase me through those corridors with photos of Christopher Lee. So yeah, I started out with Hammer, and then we would have some late night movies shown, what we used to call the BBC double bills, that have become very famous now, almost like our equivalent in this country of the kind of 1950s movie showings that you had in the States. And one of the movies that was shown in the double bill was called The Crazies, which was George A. Romero's film. And I think of any film of that era that I saw around about that time that had the biggest impact on me. It didn't scare me, but there was something about the nihilism of the film that I really kind of responded to, and the realism of it, that sort of muddy sound, and the whole thing about the collapse of society. And again, I remember the exact date it was shown. It was kind of July 1978, so I'd have just turned 11. And I think it was that movie that really turned me on to the genre, sort of 11. Actually, I didn't really get a chance to see a lot of the 30s and 40s horror movies. Not a great deal. They wouldn't be shown a great deal. I do remember seeing Son of Dracula, the Lon Chaney Jr. Movie. And eventually, of course, I saw Frankenstein and Dracula. The first ones.
Just to clarify, was that Son of Dracula with Lon Chaney Jr. that you saw?
Yeah, did I say Son of Dracula? Yeah, Son of Dracula. I think that was one of the first movies that I saw of the universe, and I gradually managed to catch up with most of the classics as time went on. Actually, I remember that one of the first horror movies I saw on TV was The Hounds of Zaroff, the Most Dangerous Game, 1932, the RKO picture. I remember I saw that probably when I was about 10. So I saw a smattering of the classics,
Yeah.
you know. And of course, things like Abbott and Costello, Meet Frankenstein, those movies. I kind of loved all of that stuff. But I guess it was only when video came in for me that I managed to see a lot of contemporary films, stuff that was coming out in the 80s, like The Thing and The Howling, but I was always wanted to see those movies, more than anything. Dawn of the Dead was a big influence on me. We still didn't have a cinema then, and actually I saw that before it came out on video, so that must have been about 1980, something like that. And what happened is in the town is because we had no cinema, we used to have a lot of film shows on 16mm, so people would rent out halls and clubs and churches, and they just showed movies on 16mm. And there was a company in the town called Aveling Barford, and they used to make dumper trucks and agricultural machinery. And one day they decided to have a film screening for all of the kids, the sons and daughters of the workers in this thing. So we all crowded into this hall around the 16mm projector, and it was Dawn of the Dead. So you can imagine how excited we all were when sort of zombies were tearing people's throats out and biting into arms, and we thought it was the greatest thing we'd ever seen, and then a couple of weeks later, they hired Martin, the other Romero movie. And actually, I'd seen the Crazies by then, so in a way, I recognized things from the Crazies in Dawn of the Dead, and I think even that made me start thinking about directors. But the movie that really kind of made me understand how films were made was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when that came out in the late 70s. And I managed to persuade my parents to take me to the big cinema in the city, to see that movie. And I bought the behind the scenes book and learned all about Spielberg and what a director does. So by the time I saw Dawn of the Dead, I was kind of reading about directors in House of Hammer, directors like Lieberman and David Cronenberg and Romero. So I guess I was just kind of, I guess in a way I was unwittingly a horror movie scholar from a very, very early age. And just being a fan, you just pick this kind of stuff up.
You found a way to improvise and overcome. Only 3 channels, no theater in your town, but there were other ways to get access to the films. And in later years, the VCR helped you out as well. So you were able to make up for lost time and really become an authority on all sorts of horror and sci-fi films. Jon, you talk about horror today. It's incredibly huge, as you probably know, here in the States. What is the state of horror in England? Is it as big there as you think it might be in America? What's the status of it?
In terms of distribution, it's still huge. It's very popular. It looks like it's moved from being a niche product that it was in the kind of 90s. After the sort of the Blair Witch Project, horror became big again, and we've seen the longest sort of golden age, if you will, of horror, and it's popular in Britain in the same as it is in other places in the world. And we have a lot of festivals, horror movie festivals in Britain, just as there are in other countries. So, we've got the big festival in London, Fright Fest. We've got festivals in Manchester, Nottingham, Sheffield. Even Whitby had a horror movie festival up until recently. So, yeah, horror is big with audiences. And it's big with filmmakers, and it's always been popular with low budget filmmakers. And of course, since filmmakers started working on digital with digital production and post production,
Yeah.
the costs have lowered considerably, giving access to new filmmakers, and horror's always been seen as a way into the industry, and we've got quite a few boutique Blu-ray distributors in this country now, like Arrow and Second Sight, 101 Films, 88 Films, the list goes on. So there's a lot of there's a lot of appeal, and a lot of people still want horror. There's still magazines being produced, loads of websites, podcasts in this country. It's a very popular genre.
Tell me more about Fright Fest in London. I had not heard about that, but sounds like that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I actually moved away from London when Fright Fest really took off, so I haven't been to many. I went to, I think, the first or the second Fright Fest that was organised, and I remember a couple of movies that stood out for me that I saw there. The first one was Toby Hooper's Eggshells, which was the movie he made before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that was fascinating to be able to see that film, knowing Texas Chainsaw so well. And the second one was a preview of Paul Schrader's cut of The Exorcist Dominion, I think it's called, Exorcist Dominion, and that was shown at Fright Fest as well. And since then, Fright Fest has just become huge. And, it's got arms across the country as well, different cities, show different, they show that they run different arms of the festival. Festivals that I'm kind of more familiar with are the more local festivals that I kind of covered as a journalist, like Mayhem in Nottingham, which has been running for about 10 or 12 years, and Celluloid Screams in Sheffield, which has been running for around about the same time. And those festivals are always really popular. They have great special guests. Frank Henenlotter came over to Celluloid Screams a couple of years ago. Brian Usner's been there. And they show a good mix of new movies that are shown there before they're even streaming, or before they're distributed. I know that people from Fright Fest, as well as people from Mayhem and Celluloid Screams, they go off to Cannes every year to check out what the new movies are. So they really kind of got their finger on the pulse of what the new horror movies are.
They have some great names for the conventions. Mayhem in Nottingham, Celluloid Screams. I mean, I'd want to go to see those.
Yeah, they're great.
I love those names, yeah. I want to spend most of the rest of the time, Jon, talking about your newest book, which came out in 2023. It is called 40 Cult Movies, From Alice, Sweet Alice to Zombies of Mora Tau. And I want to start out with kind of a basic question. How do you define a cult movie? That's a term that I use. A lot of people use the term. I guess everybody maybe has a different interpretation. In your mind, what does that mean? Cult movie, define it.
Well, I guess the easiest way for me to define it is, a movie that's going to have some kind of niche appeal. It's really not going to belong too much to the mainstream. It's going to maybe won't find an audience when it first comes out. It's a movie that kind of takes a little bit of time to catch on with people. I think often what's attracted to me to these movies is that there's something about the content, the material that's being covered that's kind of definitely a little bit radical, a little bit outside of the mainstream. A lot of them do tend to be horror in the book. I think I just kind of gravitate towards horror in a big way. But there are kind of world cinema entries in there, the science fiction movies in there as well.
Was it difficult to narrow down to 40 titles, 40 films?
Yeah, it kind of was, because I wanted it to have a kind of an A to Z thing going on, but I also wanted each individual entry to discuss other movies along the way. So that actually I kind of cover a lot of films in addition to the 40. I probably had about 70 candidates, and that sort of narrowed down. I just think as well, I just wanted to kind of put what I thought were the best movies, and the ones that I thought I'd written about, and the essays that I'd written that I particularly thought were particularly interesting ones. I wanted to include.
Yeah. With some help from you, I have picked 8 films of the 40 that we're going to spend some time with, and we'll do this chronologically. The first film is pretty controversial, from 1932, Todd Browning's Freaks. It's a film that is tough to watch. It was tough to watch back then. It was actually banned after a short run in American cinema, banned in other countries. When you look at this film all these years later, do you still find it tough to watch?
Funnily enough, I don't. I don't find it tough to watch, because for me, the film is really kind of laced through with this kind of sense of compassion. And I think that's partly because I know something about the background to it. And I really do think that the film stands in opposition to the kind of eugenics movement that really kind of picked up steam by 1932, because by that year there was a huge convention in New York City about eugenics, and that eugenics had really kind of entered mainstream by then, and it was a very strong ideology, a way of dividing people in terms of their perceived sort of superiority based on their genes, and of course eugenics would become vilified, or because what's the word? It would no longer be palatable by the time Hitler picked it up in the mid to late 1930s. So I think it was a very kind of distasteful ideology at the time, as seen by a lot of people, and I think Todd Browning was one of those who would have shared a very strong sense of distaste for eugenics. So I think that originally Browning he wanted to make a film that actually showed circus performers in a very sympathetic light, and I think he shied away from some of the horrific aspects of the film that actually the studio kind of wanted him to include, that the whole idea of revenge and so on. And sort of people that at the time who knew Browning said that actually he didn't want the revenge angle in there at all. He just wanted a very sad story about these circus performers who tried to assimilate into the mainstream world, but they weren't allowed to. They were pushed out. So it was a kind of a sad story for Browning. But of course, it's a very hard watch. And again, there's a certain ambiguity to the film as it stands, that you really don't know where your sympathies lie. At first, they seem to be with the circus performers, and then it switches because they become kind of quite monstrous when they exact revenge in the second half of the movie.
Would you consider it a classic today?
It's a flawed classic. It's one of those. I don't know if I can make this comparison without being a little bit too audacious, but when you think of a movie like The Magnificent Ambersons, for example, Orson Welles, it's not the movie that it should have been. It's very truncated. It's very changed. And I think if we consider the original version that Browning made, that had a lot more stuff in there, a lot more background into the circus life, I think that it is a classic. As it stands now, it kind of feels like it's a bit disjointed, maybe a little bit unsatisfactory in some ways as a viewing experience. So, I think it's a classic, but it's a flawed classic.
Oh my gosh. I still have not had an opportunity to see that movie. I know that we've chatted about this movie, Bruce and I, in the past on a past episode. So it is still on my watch list to dig in and have a look at that movie. But let's move on to 1968, The Planet of the Apes. I love this movie. It's one of my favorite movies, and I actually love the franchise. But I've not seen any of the quote unquote new versions of the Planet of the Apes, just the old school stuff. So would you like to chat about that movie for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I've seen a couple of the new movies. I don't think I've seen the latest one, which I think is called War for the Planet of the Apes. I haven't seen that one, so I don't really have a sense of how the franchise as a whole has developed in terms of the new movies, and whether you can compare them to the movies from the 60s and 70s. But movies from the 60s and 70s are kind of fascinating to me because I think that they work really well as a movie for kids. I really loved them as a kid because you could really get into the kind of the concept of it. It was such an imaginative concept. You could really get lost in that. And as a kid, I used to read a lot of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, so I really loved, and John Wyndham. So I really loved kind of going into these kind of science fiction worlds, fantasy worlds. So it worked really well for me as a kid. But as I got older, I kind of realized that there was a lot of stuff in there that was kind of allegorical, that the kind of stuff about the 60s, stuff about peace, love, flower power, the bomb, feminism, immigration, race wars, all of that stuff is in those movies, and it's quite upfront. And I think even when they were making the movies, they were aware that it was a message movie. And I think Charlton Heston actually said to the head of 20th Century Fox, "This is a great movie. It's got a message, you know." And I just think that the piece that I wrote for the book, it kind of says that message is still seems to me to be quite relevant. We've got to be careful because we're going to blow ourselves up. We're going to destroy ourselves if we're not careful. We need to learn to live. We need to coexist in terms of different races and so on. I just think it's a wonderful franchise, especially that the original franchise, because it's so imaginative. That jump, how they get from one movie to the next. You get Planet of the Apes, and it's a downer ending. How we're going to follow that? Then we have Beneath the Planet of the Apes, goes further and deeper into it with the whole idea of how we ended up with the apes ruling, and this kind of reverse situation where the apes are ruling and humans are the servile one. And then from there, we escape from the Planet of the Apes when they go back in time. So the apes go back in time, and you create this amazing time loop where it's almost like they're playing with the idea of time travel and what's going to happen. Are we going to end up where we started, or can we change time? Can we change the direction of our destiny? So it's such a wonderful concept, and it's almost like they had planned the whole concept out because it's such a perfect conclusion to that time loop. They couldn't possibly have planned it out because they didn't know if they were going to make 5 movies. They didn't know if the first movie was going to be a success. They thought it might get laughed off the screen, with the ape makeup and so on. So I just think it's a very masterful and interesting franchise, and I can't think of a better franchise in terms of science fiction. Just as thought-provoking science fiction, for me, some of the best kind of science fiction movies of the 60s and 70s were those Planet of the Apes movies.
Oh my gosh. I know. I totally agree. I remember watching them many, many years ago and recently just watched a couple of them, I'd say within the last 6 months. And I kind of did a double take. I'm like, yeah, you could definitely relate to those movies today. And I still love them. I still love them.
They're such wonderful fun, but they're just intelligent movies too, you know. So you know, there's so much, they're so thoughtful. You know, there's so much to get out of those films.
The ending to the original may be the greatest ending to a sci-fi film ever. I don't know how you beat it.
Agreed, Bruce.
I mean, yeah, I mean, and I still remember seeing it for the first time, and what, you know, I mean, that twist really worked for me, and just imagine being an audience and seeing it in '68, and how cleverly they just kind of misdirection of the movie. Well, I think the first time I saw the movie, actually saw it in a cinema, probably about 10 years old. I saw it in a double bill with Escape from the Planet of the Apes. So for years, I didn't realize that there was a movie missing in between. So I thought, well, this makes sense. You know, the first movie is Charlton Heston, the second movie is Roddy McDowall coming to our planet. So that made like a nice double bill. So it was great.
Another great film from 1968 is in your book too. It's Night of the Living Dead. This is one of the few movies that legitimately scared me. I made the mistake of watching it at home. Nobody else was around. I think my parents were traveling. So I'm alone in the house watching this film for the first time, not exactly knowing what's going to happen. That was a big mistake on my part, but a powerful movie in a lot of ways.
Very much so. You know, I was thinking about this the other day, that we become so familiar with these movies and the concepts that we actually forget how disturbing the concept is at its base. You know, the idea of the dead coming back to life to try to, you know, hunt down the living is actually a very, very frightening concept. The same as Frankenstein, you know, the basic concept there of somebody taking pieces of corpses and trying to make a monster out of it is a very unsettling and disturbing concept. So I think the first movie, because it introduced that in a very upfront way, was probably the most scary of all of Romero's films. And I guess the black and white does something as well. You know, there's something that really works well in terms of the black and white photography in the movie, and the claustrophobia of the movie. You know, the idea of being stuck in that house, those things trying to get in at you, is a very, very unsettling scenario, which is played out in very disturbing ways through the film. So it's a film that really didn't pull any punches at all in terms of horror, and, you know, just how far they were willing to go in terms of the emotion horror, you know, that you get in that film. So yeah, I agree. It's a very disturbing film, even though it's kind of a bit creaky in places, you know, especially near the beginning. But
yeah. My favorite actor in the movie is the lead, Dwayne Jones. He's an African-American actor. He became the first Black actor to portray really an heroic role in a horror film. And he does it beautifully. He was a guy who didn't make a lot of movies during his career, spent a lot of time as a college professor, like one of your jobs.
mm,
And he was very good at that. He only, I think, made 5 or 6 movies. And then sadly, he had heart disease and he died very young at the age of 51. And I don't think a lot of people realize how good Dwayne Jones was, not only in this film, but as an actor, period.
yeah, I'm not that familiar with his work apart from Night of the Living Dead. And I mean, I know he did a movie called Ganja and Hess, which I've not had the fortune of seeing. But I agree. Yeah, he's very, very strong in that movie, you know, and he's very real in that movie as well. I mean, he's a hero, but he's scared. You know, he's just trying to do the best he can. He's not always right. He's kind of quick to anger, which is understandable in the circumstances. Um, but I think that what Jones did was it just kind of was very much in the moment, so you can really identify with his character, because it's kind of like, yeah, that's a very believable and plausible response to this situation. Uh, I mean, him having to kind of try and hold it all together as well for everybody.
John, next on the list is a film that is not as well known. I think it's really good, very underrated. It has Roddy McDowall and Pamela Franklin, The Legend of Hell House. What do you like about that?
Well, this is a kind of a movie I've really discovered or rediscovered recently. I saw it when I was a kid, back in those halcyon days. I seem to have seen every movie when I was about 10. I don't know why. It was a big year for me. But Legend of Hell House, I remember it coming on TV and watching it. And I didn't really remember much of it. And I kind of look back in my mind and I thought it probably wasn't that memorable a movie. But when I watched it again, maybe 5 years ago, it just seemed to be incredibly well directed. And it was directed by a British director called John Hoff, who I actually was fortunate enough to meet uh, in the 80s when he was making a Barbara Cartland adaptation called A Hazard of Hearts, had Diana Rigg in it, Edward Fox, Helena Bonham Carter. I was an extra in the movie, and I kind of followed John Hoff during an off moment when he wasn't directing the movie, and I sort of got a mini interview out of him talking about Hammer movies, in fact, because he'd done Twins of Evil. And I kind of got, this is kind of unfair to say in a way, I suppose, but I kind of got the impression he was a little bit of a journeyman director. When I was watching him direct that movie, I thought, he wasn't that distinguished. But when I watched Hell House again, I realised just what a great job he'd done as a director. The use of the camera uh, alongside Alan Hume, it really made me rethink Hoff as a director. And went and looked again at some of the stuff he'd done, the Avengers, and I realised that he'd actually brought a hell of a lot to his films, the way he directed them. So the Hell House one, I think that appealed to me because it really made me think again about what John Hoff had done. And I know that the writer, his name's, oh God, I forgot his name. Richard, can you?
Matheson.
He
Matheson?
wrote I Am Legend.
Richard Matheson. Yes.
Richard Matheson. Sorry, I'm having a senior moment, as they say here. I know he wasn't that pleased with the way the film turned out, and I'm really surprised because I think the film is a complete success as a horror movie, and an interesting riposte to Legend of Haunting of Hill House as well. An interesting kind of different approach to that kind of subject matter.
Plus Roddy McDowall. Roddy McDowall's always great.
He's great, and he's very understated. Again, this was me going back, and I had this, thinking back about Roddy McDowall, always seemed to me to be quite a histrionic actor, a little bit over the top, But when I went back, looked at Hell House, I thought he was fantastically restrained, and all of the emotion is in his face. And there's a great scene where the camera just kind of stays on him for about 2 minutes without cutting, and he plays this very intense, difficult scene, and he does it absolutely brilliantly. It's a movie. It's a great movie for me personally to kind of reconsider.
3 years later, 1976, a film comes out that you've become a big fan of, Alice, Sweet Alice. Notable in that it's Brooke Shields' first feature film, but in a broader sense, it's really a disturbing movie because a murder takes place in a church right before communion.
Yeah. It's a creepy premise. It's one of those movies that it just has this kind of queasy atmosphere to it. And I always loved it for that. It was one of those movies I'd read about in House of Hammer magazine, saw it on VHS, early 80s, and I kind of revisited it about 5 years ago. And it had always stayed with me, the atmosphere of the movie. And I realized when I watched it again what it was, and it was the brilliant production design of the director, Alfred Soule. Alfred Soule started out as a movie director, but he ended up going into television working as a production designer, but he trained as an architect. And he did all of the production design on Alice Sweet Alice himself, even as far as, buying the costumes for the actors. It's set in 1962 in this kind of like very repressed Catholic community in Paterson, New Jersey. So you don't really go that far outside of the vicinity that the movie's taking place in, which is all kind of like these low rent apartments, the churches that the families go to, and everything is kind of got this dark, musty feel to it, and the houses or the apartments have, they've all got sort of like Roman Catholic kind of iconography in there, rosaries and crucifixes on the walls and all of that kind of stuff. So I think for me, it's got some really interesting plot turns in it. But the thing, what really makes it for me is that that sense of it being a great kind of Catholic horror movie about the Catholic Church, in a similar way to what Martin is. That's another great horror movie about the Catholic Church and about Catholic faith, kind of like in America in the 60s and 70s. So that's really why I love that film.
Next on the list is the film that I have not seen and I've had trouble finding. Maybe you can help me find it. Got to be out there somewhere. But you really enjoy this one. It's not that well known, and maybe that'll change in the coming years. 1978, The Redeemer, Son of Satan. I know very little about this one. Tell us what the main storyline is.
Well, Bruce, it's completely bonkers, and that's why I love it. It's a mix. It's a slasher, but it's also a kind of a satanic thriller, a la The Omen. So the movie starts with a shot of a lake, and there's an opening title, and it says, "From the dead, the Redeemer shall rise, to avenge the sinners of the world." And then you get this kind of 10-year-old boy who just materializes from the lake. You see his hand, and then you see him rise out of the lake, and then he walks into this town. And then we cut to this, again, a Roman Catholic priest in the church praying. And then this boy turns up in the confessional. And this boy, you don't know who he is. You assume he's the son of Satan, as the title tells us. And then the priest inexplicably grows this second thumb on one of his hands. So already it's kind of crazy. Right, then we cut to a completely new storyline, which introduces us to a number of characters who are all sinners in the eyes of the movie. We wouldn't consider them to be sinners now, but in terms of very staunch religious belief, they're sinners. And they all go to this high school reunion, and they find they're the only people there, and they all get killed off one by one by this strange figure called the Redeemer. And the Redeemer takes on various different guises in the movie, including an extremely disturbing and grotesque clown who proceeds to drown one of them in the school showers. And it turns out the Redeemer... Can I get a spoiler? You can blank this out. Or shall I not reveal it? Well, you can guess who the Redeemer is, because it's a book ending. So at the end of the movie, you're kind of thinking, what have I just seen?
Yeah.
this movie doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But again, it has this very queasy, strange atmosphere that's, it kind of gets under your skin. So a very, very strange movie, and it maybe very culty movie. It's a kind of movie you would kind of expect somebody like Jodorowsky or David Lynch to make. It's that got a surreal edge to it, that I don't think was intended. Actually, I don't, I think it started out as a straight slasher movie, but then The Omen came out and the producers said to the scriptwriter, we want you to put a devil child in there somewhere. So, it's kind of thrown in there, bolted on. But it just makes it even more fascinating, I think.
Jon, I'm having trouble finding it. I looked on YouTube. There were snippets of the film. There's a trailer.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find the entire film. Is it on DVD? Any suggestions on where you might find it streaming?
It was streaming on Amazon Prime.
Oh, okay.
Until recently. I think the most recent release is by Code Red, the label Code Red. So it may well be on Blu-ray under that. I know there have been some previous releases under different titles. I think one of the titles is something like High School Reunion Massacre. I can't remember exactly. I think it's that is one of the titles.
The original title is a lot better.
The original title was just The Redeemer, and that's actually the title on the movie print that I saw quite recently. It was a Code Red movie print. So it could be The Redeemer, could be The Redeemer Son of Satan, or it could be High School Reunion Massacre.
All right, we'll be on the lookout for that.
Yeah,
two more films that I wanted to talk about. They're better known, certainly from 1982, Creepshow, which was very successful. A great anthology. Some have called it the best of all the anthology films. It's got some tremendous stories. The Crate, Something to Tide You Over. Big name cast, Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, Adrienne Barbeau, Hal Holbrook. 5 stories, and really they all are pretty darn good.
Yeah, they are. But, when it first came out, critics weren't that pleased about it. Critics really didn't rave about it. And the movie did well when it came out. I think it was number 1 at the box office for a little while. I think Warner Brothers put it out. And then United Artists, I think, put it out on home video, where it did quite well. But I think critics were a little bit sniffy about it. And maybe for that reason, Romero and King didn't get to make The Stand, which is what they were hoping to make. And they wrote and made Creepshow as a kind of a calling card to show that as a team that they could produce the goods. But for some reason, The Stand didn't happen. But yeah, I agree. Creepshow, is a great fun movie. It's a movie in the tradition of the EC comic. I'm not sure how familiar audiences of today might be with the idea of the EC comic from the 1950s. So it's a very deliberate homage to those comics and what those comics were all about, and that kind of gives it an extra edge. I think it does work extremely well as an anthology movie. Anthology movies hadn't really been that popular after the kind of amicus movies of the 60s and 70s. They'd fallen out of favor. Well, maybe so because they'd fallen out of favor. Critics were saying, anthologies movies never really do that well. But then after Creepshow, you kind of got things on like Amazing Stories. Twilight Zone was rebooted, and anthology movies and anthology TV suddenly became more familiar for audiences. So I think an audience kind of looking back now on Creepshow will probably be more, you find it more amenable, something that they're more familiar with in terms of, having seen anthology TV shows. And of course, there's the Creepshow anthology TV show as well. Creepshow 2, the Michael Gornick directed sequel, again wasn't particularly well received when it was released, but it's now kind of been reevaluated. There's a lot more love being shown for that movie as well. So yeah, I still think it's a great fun film. It's got a lot to offer, as you say. That crate as a mini movie in itself is a really wonderful piece of
Yeah.
piece of filmmaking, edited by Paul Hirsch, who edited Carrie. You know, Brian De Palma's regular editor. It's really well cut that sequence.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a good movie. I'm not sure if it's one of Romero's best movies, but it's certainly a really interesting movie that digs into Stephen King and George Romero's early kind of influences in EC comics.
All right, John, one last film to go. Relatively recent movie, Drag Me to Hell, which came out in 2009. It stars an actress, Alison Lohman, who I thought would become a bigger star. She's very good in the movie. She plays a bank officer who refuses to give a loan to this older woman. And then the woman attacks her and puts a curse on her, and life is hell for Alison Lohman the rest of the way.
Yeah, I really like this film, you know, and I thought it was something of a sort of comeback for Sam Raimi into the horror fold. You know, after he'd done some really good movies in between, but this was one that really kind of saw him kind of going back to the kind of the best things he'd done about, you know, the best things about Evil Dead and so on. But what makes it a great movie for me is that it's in that tradition of the sort of casting the rune. You know, Curse of the Demon, Night of the Demon is a very similar story. That idea of a curse, and how do you get rid of a curse once you've been cursed? And it's a very inventive film again in the way that you would expect from Raimi. You know, there's lots of invention in there, lots of unexpected plot twists. You've got a very likable protagonist in Alison Lohman. I agree, she's really good, and I've always and she's kind of like disappeared a little bit. I always keep looking out for her, you know, thinking that I'm seeing her in a movie, but there's another actress who seems to be very much like her who's been working, but is not her. So that's been a little bit of confusing. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's another great fun film, a great fun crowd pleasing, great movie at parties. You know, jumping back to those days back in the VHS days. I don't know if you did the same, but I used to love having video parties. I used to invite my friends around. We used to put movies on. They always used to be crowd pleasing movies. I don't know how many times I've shown Dawn of the Dead or The Evil Dead or Lucio Fulci movies, just for the fun of it with my friends. But I think Drag Me to Hell is one of those movies that you just very happily put on, you know, with your friends around and just have a great time with it.
All of these films and many others featured in John's newest book from 2023, 40 Cult Movies from Alice, Sweet Alice to Zombies of Mora Tau. The book is available at Amazon and other venues as well. John, do you have a website too where people can visit and purchase the book?
Yeah, the best place to get it is just straight from Amazon. If you go onto I've got my webpage on Amazon, my Amazon page. You can get links to all of my books there. You can also get to it through my Twitter and through Instagram as well.
What is your Twitter handle?
It's System Shocks. System Shocks.
System Shocks. Okay.
System. Yeah, I got that handle because that's what I was going to call my first book. Shocks to the System.
Okay.
But
that's a great handle.
I settled for subversive horror cinema instead, but I kept System Shocks for my Twitter. And
all right, very good. System Shocks is John's Twitter handle. And again, visit Amazon.com to purchase 40 Cult Movies and any of his other books. There are many good ones on that Amazon page for our guest, Jon Towlson. John, we really appreciate the time. Thank you for being with us. It's been fun.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a blast. Thank you.
Well, you are most welcome. We've enjoyed it. Our thanks to author Jon Towlson and also to my co-host and producer, Tracy Asteria. We appreciate their contributions over this past hour. We want to thank everybody for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre, and we hope you'll join us next time right here in the Ghostly Gallery.